Yes, it was an ancient classic. But it actually wasn't that old. Only about 100 years ago that the author wrote a book that we desperately need a sequel of. Unfortunately, the author is now long gone dead. And that is Albert Schweitzer. So the book was published in 1906, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And I almost never read it. But many scholars and many people, as I started to try to understand the life of Jesus better, often cited it as one of those books that you must need, the foundation of the historical quest. So Albert Schweitzer was kind of a Renaissance man. So all before his 30th birthday, he was a German theologian, well published. He was a recognized organist. And on top of all that, he became a medical doctor and went down to Africa to help the African people. Like, boom! So he was a one-of-a-kind man. So it is going to be hard, and I mean it's going to be hard to replace him. But I have a couple of ideas of people who would be well suited to write the sequel to the book that we need. And that is The Quest of the Historical Jesus 2. A little bit back context is The Quest of the Historical Jesus, if you have never read it before, was written in 1906 and then in German, because of course, like I said, Albert Schweitzer was a German, so he wrote in German, and most of his research was in German, because the Quest of the Historical Jesus largely started in Germany. It has now transferred outside of Germany a little bit, but a lot of the key information was there. But there was quickly translated in English in 1908, I believe, and that is what I get my book that I read, because I do not read the German. I did get to read the English. So I think it was probably one of the first books about the historical Jesus that was published for the general audience. Correct me, I could be wrong, comment down below if I am, but it really does seem to be one of the very first books published for the general audience, which was well received by the general audience, as people started to understand, try to figure out if Jesus was a historical figure in the past, what can we understand about him through the sources? And Albert Schweitzer contributes greatly to the quest. In fact, he almost contributed so much that he was a nail in the coffin. It took 2 world wars and a whole change of mindset of how we view the historical Jesus to finally crawl out of that wet blanket and get back to actually researching the man, Jesus of Nazareth, to better understand who this carpenter turned preacher really was, beyond the creeds and the statements of faith and the commonly held misconceptions, some correct, but many misconceptions held by the general population of Christians. So let me tell you a few reasons why I think we need the sequel for The Quest of the Historical Jesus. So there's 4 reasons that I could think of here. 1, so Albert Schweitzer was an amazing summary of individual thoughts. And just that alone would save me thousands, hundreds, if not thousands of hours of reading. And who knows how many cache of all the books you would not need to have to buy and read to get a better grasp of where The Quest of the Historical Jesus is right now. The sequel could summarize the individual thoughts of each of the contributors, like Dale Allison, of how he's shifted our minds. Albert Schweitzer, or someone similar in his vein, could summarize that in a few paragraphs and gives a key understanding of what it is. So back to some of his original contributions. 1, on these premises, it is possible to write a life of Christ. It is not possible to write a life of Jesus. It is therefore not by accident that Scottmaster, I probably got that one wrong, regularly speaks not of Jesus but of Christ. Boom! Zinger! Wow! Imagine someone summarizing that way. And another one, in order to understand Strauss, one must love him. He was not the greatest and not the deepest of theologians, but he was the most absolute sincere. Whoa! And another one of his great quotes here. The course of Jesus' life, according to Brandt, was therefore as follows. Jesus was a teacher. Not only so, but he took disciples in order to train them to be his teachers. And finally, one fourth quote here. His, that is Bossuet, study is not unhistorical, but supra-historical. And there's another often attributed quote to Albert Schweitzer that I'm going to get to in the end, but it is often quoted by many scholars and academics throughout the world. So number 2 is his insight to individual impacts on the quest and our understanding of the historical Jesus. Quote him again here. The main distinction between Strauss and his predecessors consists of the fact that they themselves anxiously how much of the historical Jesus would remain as a foundation for religion if they dared to apply the conception of myth consistently, while for him, this error had no terror. We really could use that today. Not necessarily that quote, but someone who could summarize what exactly has Croissant added to our understanding of historical Jesus. How is he changing our vision of the historical Jesus? Let me give you another quote. So Albert Schweitzer writes this. Renan had given him a figure which was theoretically, no doubt, but full of life and movement, that they had been grateful to him for it. Strauss could not do that. See that contrast there? So you can read multiple different authors and go, oh yes, I see where the one is coming from this perspective and he's seeing this, but the same Jesus from this perspective, you would see something entirely different. The writer of the sequel would be able to give us that perspective to see it is where the person is standing, where they're seeing things, that why we're seeing a different picture. So reason number 3 that we need this sequel, the type that Albert Schweitzer contributed here, was big pictures and moves. So the quest for the historical Jesus, and this may be changing right now, was largely based off of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Mark being in priority. And the reason for that is largely because of what Albert Schweitzer brings to the conversation. His big push is that how he changed how researchers started looking and professors started looking at the historical Christ. This is, the question is decided, the Gospel of John is inferior to the Synoptics as a historical source, just in proportion it is more strongly dominated than they by theological and apologetic interest. So Albert Schweitzer, after doing much research and much reading, much studies, did a big shift in how we perceive the historical Jesus and the sources we know about him. We need somebody to do that again in the sequel. Another one of his quote big pictures moves. They all betrayed the Jesus of liberal theology. The only difference is that one is a little more consistent in his color than another, and on this perhaps has a little more than taste than another, or a little less concerned about the consequences. And this is so true. Many professors and scholars and academics about the historical Jesus have only regurgitated the exact same picture that has been roughly around for about 100 years now, give or take a little bit, that they have not actually added anything to our understanding of the historical Jesus, just merely giving different shades and colors of this historical Jesus as we know him. Fourth, and this one didn't really take roots until many years later. If I was to guess, it was almost 80 years later where it really took root. One of the great things that he contributed to the quest for the historical Jesus is the simple fact that Jesus was a Jew. And as a Jew living in Nazareth, Judea, we must understand him in that context. Jesus was not a German revival leader. Jesus was not an English Puritan. Jesus was a Jew. And Albert Schweitzer would argue, and most people have started to agree with him among the academics, is Jesus was an apocalyptic Jewish prophet. And the only way that we can understand his life is we understand it in his Jewish context. And that is why we need someone to write this sequel, because the game has really changed. Like I said, Albert Schweitzer was very keen putting down that seed of Jesus being a Jew, which took full bloom probably under E.P. Sanders, who argued that yes, this was the context of Jesus in his Jewish context, and we don't have to have a hate on for the Jews. They were, many of them, with their diversity of religion still had a love for God, and that we can respect for them. And Jesus too was inside that playpen, trying to understand what he was trying to understand his role in fulfilling God's mission. It's kind of like football and American football. We are not talking about the same quest for the historical Jesus that Albert Schweitzer was summarizing and analyzing when he wrote his original book. It has changed so much. Jesus' Jewishness, how we look at the sources, it has all changed so much that it is no longer football, aka soccer, it is now American football, or vice versa. The rules have changed, the game has changed, it is a different sport. And we have new contributors with new thoughts. We have, let me see if I can find them here. Where is it? Oh, Crossan's World Game Changer, one of the predominant members of the Jesus Seminar, the historical Jesus, the life of a Mediterranean Jewish peasant, has really changed how we view Jesus, if not strictly because of the pushback after him writing this book. Another big game changer is Dale Ellison. Dale Ellison has written quite a few books, but one of the biggest things is his contribution is we don't need to longer sift through individual sources and words and parse to see whether or not they actually were from Jesus. But just say, well, if the constant theme was that, the gist is probably that, and leave it at that. E.P. Sanders, like I said, he redeemed the Jewishness of Jesus, making it no longer a dirty word or dirty context, but something in which Jesus cherished and thrived in, obviously. There's also like John Meyer, Gaza Vermis. There's so many new contributors that we need someone who could read through them all and summarize them all up and keenly analyze them so we could get a better perspective of who they are. So if I was a publisher, which I am not, but if I was a publisher, my number one pick would be you already know him. Yes, exactly. I would pick Bart Ehrman. If nothing else, because he's the most recognized New Testament scholar I think there is in North America, maybe even the world. Love him or hate him, and there's many people on both sides, he is well recognized. And he brings a vast knowledge, the history of the quest for the historical Jesus, and many of the studies on it. He's very well read and knowledgeable. I think he would make a great contribution to writing the sequel for the quest for the historical Jesus 2. And on top of that, he already has shown that he is well versed in major moves in the scholarly work around the historical Jesus. If you watch any of his videos or read any of his books or listen to any of his podcasts, which he has all of them and many very popular ones, he often starts with, the majority of scholars say, well, the majority believe this. So he's already got that all in his head. It'd just be a matter of him sitting down for, I think he says he can write a trade book in like 2 weeks. So if he can, Bart, you got 2 weeks of work ahead of you. He could sit down and write it out and give us the historical quest to Jesus 2. But Bart Ehrman is a busy man. And I don't know, maybe he wouldn't be up to the task. So my number 2 pick, and someone picked this just because I personally love her writing style. So this is just a little bit of my own love affair of the individual author. But I think she contributes a lot to it, and she's already proven her worth in, let me see if I can find it here. There it is. The Historical Jesus, A Guide for the Perplexed by Helen K. Bond. So in some ways, she has already done it. She has started by writing a book of quick summaries of the major moves and thoughts and some of the thought leaders in regards to the historical Jesus for the common person like you and I, not scholars who've spent the last 27 zillion years in school, but have just have a keen interest in the life of Jesus. But this book is not the sequel to the quest for the historical Jesus. This is a good start. I'd actually recommend you read it if you want to get a little bit of a better sense and you're a little bit perplexed of what this historical Jesus is all about. But something that she would need to add to it to make it even better. One is she needs to analyze more the value of the weight of thoughts that people contribute in the research and the sources of which they do. She summarizes well, but you need to analyze, is this good? Is this of value? Is this helpful? What has this done to the overall movement? So she could kick it up a little notch there. And also the individual's contribution to the quest. She does a lot of, like I say, summaries of what the common consensus is among scholars in regards to different aspects of Jesus' life, like his birth or his death, but she could do more and be more insightful of it. So, like I said, I would like to see Barterman write the sequel. I would buy it and read it. And if not, I think Helen Bond would be a great contributor to the sequel. But there may be a third author that I haven't thought of that would be even better and more insightful to understand what has happened over the last 100, 200, 300 years that we have tried to take Jesus as a historical figure, not just a Messiah, Son of God, spiritual figure, but a human that lived in Nazareth, of what he had contributed to the world. Before we go, I promised you I would tell you about a quote that is attributed to Albert Schweitzer, which he never said. And it is a well-known quote. I've heard it in YouTube videos, on podcasts, and blogs that I've I might have read. Anyways, I maybe even have cited it sometimes. But it's a quote that he's never said, but it's attributed to him. Reminds me of the mythicist point about Jesus. The quote goes something like this. And this is Albert Schweitzer analyzing a summary of what he saw of all his German theologians had written up to that point about the historical Jesus. They peered down the well of history and saw their own reflection. He never said it, or if he did, he never wrote it down, but it's often been attributed to him.